there's logic and there's pathologic. Okay. If we're logical, at least the average person is logical, and I think most people are, quite often if they're being abused, the first thing they're going to say is, "What? Why would anyone do that?"
Helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. This is Win Today. And now, here's your host, Christopher Cook.
Hey friends, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me this week for episode 267, where today, as we're talking all about emotional abuse. Listen, y'all have asked me one question consistently in the last year, and that's, Chris, will you please do an episode all about emotional abuse? Well, today, here it is. Today, we're talking about the ins and outs of how to recognize the abuse, how to heal from the abuse, and how to protect others from its insidious effects. And joining me are two really trusted friends, Dr. Dave Strubler, whose 40 plus years in organizational leadership and social work have given him an up-close view of emotional abuse at work and culture. Joining Dave as well today is his son, another friend of mine, Mark Strubler, who's a licensed professional counselor, and Mark specializes in trauma recovery. So they're well qualified for this conversation today. But quickly, friends, before we head into the conversation with Dave and Mark, if you're enjoying Win Today, please share it. Send a text to a friend. Invite them to listen to this conversation especially, and then you know the drill. Rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening, especially on Apple Podcasts. Here's why. When you rate, review, and share the podcast, the listenership grows, and we get to help even more people just like you design their roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. It's as simple as that. So thank you for listening. Thank you for doing just that. Right now, here's my conversation with Dr. Dave Strubler and Mark Strubler, all about emotional abuse. You're listening to Win Today. Well, Dave and Mark, welcome to Win Today. I'm so glad to have you on the show. Dave, welcome back.
It's good to be back.
Yeah, glad to have you. Well, hey, the reason we're having this conversation today is because the number one question I receive from listeners is all about emotional abuse. So that's where we're headed today. I'd love to just head straight away in. Give us an overview about emotional abuse. Why does it show up so often? And why do you think, perhaps, this is the number one question I receive? What's going on?
Emotional abuse, unfortunately, is common and even pervasive in our society. You know, we live in a hyper-modern, hyper-anxious, hyper-individualistic society where a lot is going on right now, maybe more than we've experienced in the past, I would say. So I think that's making emotional abuse come out and come out more commonly in relationships, especially in intimate relationships. I think that's where it occurs most frequently, although it can occur at work and other places as well. So it is everywhere, we'll say that, and it is pervasive. And what it basically is about is control. And what happens is the abuser uses a person's emotions to embarrass them, shame them, blame them, otherwise manipulate them, in essence. And it's non-physical, so that's one of the challenges with it. It's not typically illegal, so it's not always overt. Sometimes it's covert, so it's hard to see and hard to recognize. And, you know, it might even, you hear someone make, for example, a passive-aggressive comment, and you go, what was that? You know, where did that come from? And I just finished watching Downton Abbey. It's full of it. It's absolutely full of it. So, and we see it, of course, in a lot of the television shows we see today. But more importantly, we see it in our own lives. Happens in families a lot. Happens in families a lot. Happens a lot in marriages. And so I think it's incredibly important right now that we talk about this, that people recognize if they're in a situation where they're being abused, and maybe they were wondering, am I being abused? Like, what's going on here?
Yes.
And it is confusing by design, I might add, by design.
Okay.
So it is about control by design. And that's really important.
Well, let's stay there for a moment, talking about control by design. It's the abuser's motivation to control and to manipulate the person with whom they're in a relationship. But I want to pause real fast, just so the listeners here joined with us are just wondering, who are Dave and Mark? Just give us a quick overview, Dave, who you are, credentials, and then Mark, do the same, just so that people know who they're listening to.
Okay, well, I got an early start in this when I was 23, 24 years old, and I was a social worker and director of an outdoor program for young people who were all abused, either physically or emotionally abused in their families. So I was a licensed social worker back in those days, and I ran an outward bound adaptive program to help young people develop a sense of self-worth and confidence, that sort of thing, and a sense of purpose in their lives. So that was my early start. Today, I'm a professor of human resource development at Oakland University. I spent 39 years in administration as a dean and manager, supervisor, associate vice president, a lot of different jobs like that. And now I can happily say that I'm a full-time professor. I'm doing research and writing and podcasting, obviously. Yeah. And but this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I've seen so many cases that have really devastated people that I know even. And so because it's so important, because it's so pervasive, I want to talk about it.
That's really good.
That's really why I'm here.
Yeah. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, so I didn't start off in counseling, which is interesting. I started in music, and obviously you and I, Chris, connect in a musical way, which is fun. But what I really enjoyed about music, and then I did some work in, engineering and all that, was the people aspect, connecting with others. And it wasn't until, some years ago that I realized, I think I want to help people. How do I do that? And then I came upon a counseling program nearby and said, this is it. This makes sense. So I immediately signed up, got in, and as soon as I was in there, except for my testing and assessment class, everything just made total sense. Yeah. I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. And, during that time, I had, personal things that I was dealing with that allowed me to really understand my own story better. And I do believe that informs my work with clients. And I mainly work with men who are experiencing or have experienced trauma, and that could be a little T trauma, which we'll talk about, or big T traumas. And I'm EMDR certified, so that's a really powerful intervention, and also what I would call IFS informed, which is internal family systems. And I'll explain the model later, especially in talking about healing from emotional abuse. And I practice in Troy, Michigan, and absolutely love working with my clients. And I, like you were saying, seeing it more and more. I'd say most, if not all, of my clients have either experienced it in the past or are experiencing it now. And it's very relevant work, and this is a very relevant topic.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for that. In fact, I don't necessarily want to drive the trajectory of the conversation, because maybe the better question at this juncture is, where's the best next step for us to go in this conversation? Because I do want to talk about the abuser's underlying goal, but is that the best place to go next? Where should we take this conversation from here? Well, I want to serve people well.
Yeah, well, maybe a simple way to do this is, maybe using the definition that I shared a little bit is non-physical behavior or attitude, could be an attitude as well, that is designed to control, subdue, punish, or isolate another person through the use of humiliation and fear. That comes right from the National Institute of Health. So that's a pretty good definition, I think. And there basically are three types of abuse that have been identified in research, and that is verbal abuse, where someone's actually using their voice, rejection, and gaslighting. And we can talk about all of those.
Love to.
And but usually it kind of falls into one of those three categories, or often it's actually a combination where somebody may be gaslighting you, rejecting you, and verbally abusing you all at the same time. So that can happen depending on the person. So I think now when we talk about physical abuse or sexual abuse, we have to keep in mind that those are emotionally impactful. But today we're going to try to focus more on just emotional abuse where it doesn't involve the physical.
Right.
And so I think that's important to make that distinction as well.
Well, it's as we talked about before we hit record, it's the black and blue bruises on the heart which make it so hard to identify, which so many of you have reached out to me and said, Chris, we've got to talk about this. Will you talk about this? Because I go throughout my day seemingly okay, yet on the inside there is a torrent of pain happening. Can we start right there?
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things we have to recognize, for example, I know one person who was verbally, emotionally abused by a father, but also by a boss. And so when I talk to this person, when I listen to what they have to say, they're even drawing parallels between the two. Because this is what my dad did, this is what my boss does, and I'm dealing with this every day. And this is an adult. This is a 50-year-old person. So it's not like it's just with children, although that happens with children. And Mark, really, you can address that, I think, better than I can as far as how that impacts someone throughout their life. But sometimes it happens even in adulthood as well. And some relationships, like a parent-child relationship, can go on and on for years and years and always be involved in sort of a underlying emotional abuse, which might be covert, but always there, sort of passive-aggressive kind of thing. So that can happen.
Why is it so hard to recognize? And that might be overly simplistic. But,
no, not at all. It is hard to recognize if you're in it, because typically, all right, so if it's your employer, you have an employer-employee relationship. They have power and control over you just by virtue of that. If it's a parent, even if it's you're an adult and it's an older parent, if the relationship has always been grounded in this control that we've been talking about by design, control by design, that can continue throughout your life. And some of this is normal too, by the way. We go through breaking away. When we're at a certain point in our life, we have to say to Mom and Dad, thanks for, your input. However, I'm a man or a woman now, and I need to make decisions. And so there's normal corrections that all of us have to make in our relationships as we go. But what we're really talking about here is someone who is literally, intentionally trying to control someone else. And Mark, maybe you can mention this too, is they may or may not be aware of it themselves that they're doing it in some cases. They might just think it's normal to them. Yeah.
So you have those 5 levels that you mentioned before. Can you just say those real quick and then I can go from there?
Yeah. So in the last podcast, we talked about the 5 stories of narcissistic abuse, or 5 levels. And the first level is just simply the passive narcissist. They're different because they're probably entitled and they aren't mean and they aren't abusive. It's all about them. So I want to make that distinction that there are some people who are narcissistic, but they're not necessarily abusive. It isn't their intent to harm anyone else.
Yeah.
But if you have a conversation with them, they may only talk about themselves. Okay, but that's not necessarily abusive. But when we get to the second level, which is really I call it the passive-aggressive narcissist, because it is definitely emotional abuse. It's intentional. It's designed to control, and somebody might literally make a passive-aggressive, comment. I think maybe last time I talked about, when Rapunzel's mother says, you're getting, you're a little chubby there. Oh, just kidding. That kind of thing.
The seed has been planted.
The seed's been planted, and they got the message. And that's the thing, is sometimes it can just be I hate to use the term, well-placed word with a particular attitude behind it, and the person gets the message. They understand that they've somehow, where'd that come from, but why, and what's the purpose here? And the purpose is always about control. When you're dealing with a narcissist, it's always about control. And then level 3 is the aggressive narcissist. This is very aggressive emotional abuse. I mean, yelling, screaming, flying into, pretty serious verbal abuse, a lot of rejection, and maybe even really severe gaslighting, which we'll talk about in a minute. But those at that level, it is aggressive, and it is really intended to harm. It can start to move into sexual or physical abuse at that level. Then levels 4 and 5, level 4 is the raging narcissistic abuser. This is usually somebody who's emotionally unstable. They're highly manipulative, and they're good at it. I think
almost strategic.
Yeah, it's very strategic.
Wow.
And I think last time I talked about how, really these folks are great actors and actresses. I mean, they really are. They're good at it, and they know how to play you. I know of one case where a person came in to a police department to report, domestic violence or whatever, and the person's sobbing and carrying on and all this sort of stuff. And it turns out none of it was true, but it was, the acting job was so good that the police actually, at least initially, believed the person and acted on it. So it can get to that level too. That's really a
Is that
level,
pathological?
It's very pathological.
Yeah.
And I maybe I said this before, I'm going to say it again. There's logic and there's pathologic. Okay. If we're logical, at least the average person is logical, and I think most people are, quite often if they're being abused, the first thing they're going to say is, why would anyone do that? Because it doesn't make sense if you're logical and if you're emotionally stable. It makes no sense to you, and especially if you're empathic.
That hits home for me. Yeah.
Then you're going to say, "What?" You'll be baffled. You'll say, "Why would anyone say that? Why would anyone do that? Why are you doing this? This doesn't make any sense." And that's a common reaction from somebody who's being abused, especially if it's an empathic person being abused by, say, a level 2 or 3 narcissist. So that's a very common thing. And people are baffled. They are. They think, did I do something to deserve this? And then, of course, the gaslighting part is where the abuser tries to convince you that you do deserve it, that you really are, know. And the big disadvantage is not as much in employer relationships, but in interpersonal ones, like marriage and that sort of thing, is that they know you. They know you're an empath, and they know what your buttons are. They know what your values are, and they can play your values against you. That's a really tough one. Because you believe in certain things, like say you believe in personal responsibility. Well, they're going to play that one because they're going to say, I know Chris has a strong sense of personal responsibility. I'm going to make him feel responsible for this. And because he's empathic too, then even more so. So, and Mark, I'd like you to comment on this. Do you think, I've heard one theory is that some people believe that narcissists, contrary to popular belief that they don't have any feelings, that they lack empathy. There's one theory I saw where the researcher said, I think it's possible that they're very empathic. That is, they can read you. Because they're empathic, they can read you. But because they're pathological, they distort it. They use it for other purposes. So I know what Chris is thinking right now. I know how he's feeling right now. And I'm going to use that.
So the way I would see that is, from a counseling perspective, and I'm a very much a root cause kind of a person. There's that person I'm seeing in the present moment, which is important, but I'm always wondering, how did they get from A to B, B being, in the room with me. So with somebody who's at that point, talking about the person who is abusing, and I do want to say it that way, I don't want to say the abuser. It's easy to say that, because we want to label.
Okay.
We want them to be other than us. And, in some cases, when you're in that level 4 or 5, for your safety and others, they do have to be other in a way in order for your safety and others' safety. So I can understand that. But I do believe these people who are in those higher, in any of these levels, have experienced some level of pain in their life. And what we're seeing in the present, or if we're the ones experiencing it, we're experiencing their pain. They're bringing us into their pain, and they're bringing it up to where it is, or they're trying to amp it up even more, because this is what feels normal to them. It feels comfortable. It's familiar. And I'm trying to think of which way to go here, with either the person who's abusing or the person who is being abused. But I'll just stay with the abuser for a second, just so we can understand. And this is not saying, oh, it's okay. But, this person has developed these, as you were talking about, Dave, these
that's really dad, cool. So it's father and son, so this is really cool.
Yes, it is very. We should establish that.
That's great.
So in regard to how they use empathy, it sounds like that they have probably developed that sense from watching through their caregivers how to develop that over time. And I would even say that, as they were probably abused growing up, emotionally, physically, sexually, any of those ways, this distortion started to happen. And this is where their own disconnection from what we'll call the self, the capital S, the true self, which I do believe we all have, that break is where they have what we call blended with these different parts. So just to say where I'm coming from, I'm talking about these parts. In the internal family systems model, there's the self, capital S. That is who you are. But over time, because of, and I don't want to go too much into genetics, but there is a small aspect there in intergenerational trauma. But your experience growing up largely informs these other parts that form. So a lot of us have parts of us, that are highly organized or are really good at cooking. These kind of, day-to-day parts, or knows how to drive a car. But then we have these other ones that form that are what we call protectors. And they protect the parts of us that we call exiles. Those are the younger parts of us that hold the pain. That's if you're a 35-year-old woman, that's the 5-year-old girl, who was ignored or neglected by mom and dad. If you're a 40-year-old man, that was, the 8-year-old who was bullied over and over and over because of maybe you had acne at that age, or maybe you had, a stage of being overweight. These things happen. We go through stages as kids, and sadly, the others in our environment aren't so kind. And so the exile holds that pain, and then we have these managers or protectors that form. And I would say most of the people I work with, they're pretty obvious, and they're more easy to work with. And they do what we call blend. That's when it's like if they're sitting there just crying or they're dissociating, I would say they're blending with that part. And my goal as a therapist is to separate with the permission of that part, to separate and reconnect to the self, who you are at the core. And the way I'm understanding the abusers is the people who abuse others is that they have been impacted so much in childhood that they've formed these extreme managers, what I would call it, or extreme protectors, because they experienced, X amount of pain. That manager or protector part of them is going to meet or exceed that level of pain, and they're going to bring it toward others. And it was interesting, your Dad, you were talking about, when people are kind of met with this behavior, and maybe they're outside of the inner circle of the people who are being abused by this person. It's you see it right away, and you're like, what's going on? Especially if you're a person who does have a higher sense of self, or has good connections with others. So you'll see that clearly. But again, the people who are in it, going back to the person who's being abused, either they were highly empathic as a child, but it showed up different as an adult. I know we're talking more about adults here, but all of this kind of forms, from childhood on, I would say.
So is this a form of Breaking Bad?
I haven't watched the entirety of the show. So
I haven't watched it
I've not either.
But it's the term.
Yeah.
Oh,
the
yeah.
idea that,
yeah.
That potentially any one of us, we come out of the chute and we're raised in a particular setting and we experience what we experience.
Yeah.
And that the interaction effects
Yes.
of all of those things.
Yes.
So, your core self, your personality, that's you.
Yes.
Interacting with, and that's why every single human being has always been and always will be completely unique.
Yes.
Because there is no human being on the planet that has exactly the same experiences plus their self.
Yes.
With the big S self.
Yes.
Automatically we're all different. And so there are good approaches or rules or whatever you want to call it for dealing with, for example, emotional abuse. And also at the same time, you'll have to adapt it to your own situation, your own setting, because it's not exactly the same for every one of us. But there are some fundamental things that we can talk about.
Go ahead. Yeah, take us in, Dave, if you'd like.
And so I think if I guess I'll go back to the person who's on the receiving end of the abuse. If, say, I'm the empathic person, say I'm the person that, and maybe I myself have had some forms of maybe bullying. That's a common one right now that we see. In young people and middle school, that's kind of
even elementary school.
And even elementary school, yeah.
Yes.
And it's impactful. Parents may not know that it's happening because the child doesn't tell them. So now they're an adult, and so they're empathic, and they've been through this difficult situation. They've been bullied, and now here's the real challenge. People always ask me, do I attract people like this? I hear that a lot. And the answer is yes and no in this sense.
Yes.
It's yes because you are empathic and you're probably literally wearing it on your sleeve. So it's easily seen by someone who, and I use the word target rather than victim, because I think it's really important, I made this point last time, is that if you are on the receiving end of narcissistic emotional abuse, keep in mind it's because the person targeted you. That's important. And the reason that's important is to know that it wasn't like you went out looking for it. See, that's where it's not that it's not that the person who's been abused is running around, please abuse me. I mean typically that's not the case. It's just that because they wear it and it's visible to a person who is an abuser, and they're tuned into it, they're looking for it, and they target people. Sometimes they target people just for that reason. I can control this person, and that's why I want to be in a so-called relationship with them. Sometimes, though, they target them for revenge. And I've seen cases of that as well. So, but the reason it's important, in my opinion, to use the word target rather than victim, even though the person is a victim, but to just keep that in mind. You didn't go looking for it. You weren't asking for it. You don't deserve it. Nobody does, by the way. Nobody deserves it. And so that's important because the abuser is going to try to convince you that you do deserve it. I wouldn't have to say these things, or if it's physical, I wouldn't have to hit you, or I wouldn't have to do this if you hadn't, if you were a better person, if you were a better boyfriend or girlfriend or daughter or son or whatever the case might be. And that's part of the gaslighting. And you're on one hand, you're verbally abusing, but you're also gaslighting the person into believing that they're the problem, that they have a problem, that, and the goal is to cause you to doubt your own sense of self, which Mark just talked about, to doubt that, to lose that sense of self so that they can control. And so it causes you to even doubt your own feelings, your own ideas, which might be perfectly good, perfectly good ideas. I've seen this at work too. And the worst case is where they try to get you to doubt your sanity, and that your sanity, the only way you can have sanity is if you rely on me, who understands reality.
Wow.
That's the real ultimate narcissist.
Put a pin real fast on gaslighting for us. We've talked about it. The term is common, but I want to make sure people understand truly what gaslighting is, because we've mentioned it a few times.
Well, it comes from the film Gaslight in 1943 or something like that.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Wow.
And it actually comes from that film. That's where the term came from. And what was happening was a man was gaslighting his wife, literally by turning down gas lights. And he kept turning them down. Each night, he would turn them down a little bit more, very systematically. It was designed, by design. And his wife kept saying, it seems to be dark in here. And he said, no, you're crazy. He said, that's where it comes from. That's where the term comes from.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so that's why it's called gaslighting. So the idea, again, is to get you to doubt your own feelings, doubt your own thoughts, doubt your own reality, doubt your own sanity, so that, and manipulating the truth. So they'll take something that's true and twist it, and you'll go, wait a minute, I thought that was a good and true thing, and somehow you managed to tarnish it. And also smear campaigns. Probably one of the biggest techniques of narcissistic abusers is they'll tell all your friends, but they'll be very subtle about it. Oh, Mark, did you know that Chris is really having a hard time right now? That kind of thing. No, I didn't know. Well, what's that all about? Well, I'm not really sure, but this is how crafty it is.
Yeah,
it's very crafty.
And this is definitely on those higher levels where it amps up.
Where it amps up, but there's a tendency for abusers to smear the other person for the purpose of isolation. In other words, wreck their reputation, basically, or cause doubt, cause people to want to push away from them. And then you have to come to me for reality, and then that gives me control.
Isolation produces vulnerability.
Yes.
That's what I hear you saying.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's the goal in that case is the goal of the gaslighting is isolation.
Wow.
So that you can control.
And then they're taught, too, that and we hear the word vulnerability. Thank you, Brene Brown, for making that term much more palatable for everybody. Sure. Because it is. Vulnerability is good. But if you're put in a place of vulnerability with this person who's creating a reality, that's not safe. And then if they're isolating you from others, then you're not able to understand what truth is anymore. There is a perception of reality, of course, with living with the person who's abusing.
Mm-hmm.
But I would even posit that the person who's abusing is afraid of truth, essentially. Because if you find out the truth, then the game's over.
Drill down on that. I want to hear more about that, Mark. That's really powerful, because if I can interject quickly, one of the things that I've been extrapolating from hearing you both is through gaslighting, through manipulation, it's to disarm and to isolate so that it creates a dependence, which there's where the manipulation manifests. So, Mark, I'd love for you to drill down on what you just said, because I think there are people listening right now going, oh my gosh, I didn't know this relationship was emotionally abusive.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So again, back to the self. I want whoever's listening to know you have a self, capital S. You have all those characteristics I named off. I'll say them again: courage, compassion, creativity, confidence, connectivity, calm. You have those. That is at your core no matter what. Nobody can take that from you. Nobody has ever had it taken from them. Does it feel like it? Yes. But what you're experiencing with this person who is abusing is they are afraid of your sense of self, because that is what is entirely true about you. And, we talk about, discrediting, isolation, and silencing. And I would say that, the self knows at its core, at your core, that your feelings and knowings and thoughts are valid. You do have the ability to connect, and you are courageous. That's who you are, among many other things. And, this is where I would really want to encourage anybody and this is what I do with my clients all the time. We're deep in this stuff, and you'll say, and I've heard this from my clients too, they'll say, so-and-so said this to me. And I know they're testing, because there's something inside of them that knows that there's something wrong about this, but they want to double check. So they bring it to me. They say, hey, my partner, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, mom, dad said, that I'm crazy. What do you think? Do you think I'm crazy? And then, thankfully, because of, how the counseling relationships works, I'm an objective third party. I can say, okay, well, tell me more about that. First off, how do you feel when they say you're crazy? Oh, I feel awful. I don't want to talk to anybody. I just want to go inside, inside yourself and shut down. And that's where I can say, I know that you're not crazy at your core. That's for sure. And we all have these parts of us. So I always validate, like, hey, we're human, but let's try to figure out what they're saying here. So, instead of me just saying, oh, no, you're not crazy, we want to unpack that a lot more and understand. And then usually the case is that person they're gaslighting them. They're telling them something that's not true about them. Or distorting something. Yeah. And I had this recently where a client got angry. And so the person who was abusing said, you have an anger problem. And they brought this to me and they said, I think I have an anger problem. I'm like, oh, well, why is that? Here's what happened. And then I was just dumbfounded. I was like, you're angry because this person, is, for lack of a better term, messing with you.
Yeah.
I think I would, want to break something too, and fly into a rage if somebody did that to me so often. And I think it makes sense that you're so angry. So I validate almost that righteous anger, I would say. And this person didn't hurt anybody while they're feeling this anger. So I validate, those other parts that are coming out. And even though that anger is not the self, I would say, it has self-like qualities, because there's kind of that little bit of confidence behind it saying, this is not right.
Yes.
And so I help that person build on that. And I'll say, hey, we're not going to be punching walls in here. So let's validate that angry part, have it step to the side, and let's connect to that core. And then what do you know that's true? It always comes back to that. What is true?
Yeah, and we know that the knowledge of, the experience with truth enables us to walk into freedom, which is where we're going to go in this conversation. I want to stay on the experience of the person being victimized, feeling trapped. Too often, they're too wounded to endure the relationship any longer, but too afraid to leave.
Yep.
Yes.
So, and a lot of people listening right now are saying, okay, this has actually just become so familiar that maybe, number one, I don't recognize it as abuse. Number two, I don't know anything else.
Yes.
So the cycle just repeats itself until something is done. So I want to spend some time on this and double click on this. Number one, they're too wounded to endure the relationship any longer. This is where I believe the broken spirit comes into play, where a trichotomy of spirit, soul, body. The spirit, the wind in the sail of the soul is gone. The fight has left. Talk about that.
I think, this is, again, it's a perception of reality that you've been brought into. And I don't know your situation, if you're in a situation right now, but I do know that what you're in, and there is that part of you that knows, that core, that something's wrong. You do know that there's something wrong, and I want to make it very clear that this is just a perception of reality that has been created. And you can take that reality back, and come into the truth and the freedom, as you said, Chris. But I do want to say, hey, this will take time. This is, depending on the level that you're at, the kind of person you're dealing with. Sometimes you have to go cold turkey, cut them off, sometimes move. I mean, I don't know your situation, and that's on an individual basis, but you do have to set up boundaries, and you have to start enforcing them. And for example, let's talk about a level 2, passive aggressive person. They're saying, oh, Mark, you're so crazy, whatever, just talking. And I can say, hey, I'm not crazy. And if you're going to talk like that to me, this conversation's over. And when you can talk to me with respect, then we can keep going. You don't have to get highly emotional over it. Just state facts. I am not crazy. That's true. And we need to take this conversation back when you can speak to me with respect, person to person.
I love that you just went there, Mark. In fact, I want to give people a quick 101 on boundaries, because folks, listen, setting boundaries isn't saying you can't do this, you can't do this. That's exerting the same level of control the other person is exerting toward you. Instead, what I heard you say is boundaries goes like this. If you continue to behave like that or talk to me like that, these are the consequences. This is what I'm going to do.
Yes.
So a lot of people listening right now might be frustrated saying, I thought I was setting boundaries. You can't do this. And we're fulminating in a fit of rage because we're scared. We're angry.
Yes.
In due cause, with due cause. But folks, what I want you to understand is that setting a healthy boundary requires you to say, if this happens, this is the boundary, this is the fence, this is the consequence. I will make this choice for myself. You can do whatever you want, but this is the choice I'm making for my mental health, my emotional health, my physical health even.
Yes, I will not engage.
Correct.
Yes.
And so it's called playing their game. So if you think of it that way, that their game, say, it would be like if I were, I'm not, but if I were 6'3" and I've been playing basketball my whole life, okay, and then I walk up to anyone else who's not 6'3" and has never played basketball, and I say, come on, let's play basketball. Why do I want to play basketball? So I can dominate you and so I can win. Okay, and that's the game that's going on. They're really good at this. Yeah, this is challenging because they are really good at this. They know how to manipulate. They know how to play your feelings. And what they're trying to do is get you to play their game by reacting in kind. And then they say, see, you're emotionally unstable. See, you're the problem. And that's how it works. And so it's a game. So what the goal here is to assertively, not aggressively, because aggression is their game.
Yes.
but to be assertive and to set a boundary, as you described there, is the solution with them. If you have to meet with them face to face, if you can't get away from the situation, which sometimes you can't, sometimes you have to deal with a person. So now what you're doing is you're managing it through assertive boundaries, but not aggressive reaction.
Wow. Assertive boundaries versus aggressive reaction. That in and of itself is so empowering.
Mm-hmm. It can be. If a person can see, the thing is, you can't wait until it happens. You have to be prepared, and seeing a counselor like Mark or learning learning how to set assertive boundaries from some source. Mm-hmm. And being encouraged in that, and because that's your game. Your game is assertive boundaries. Make that your game. Get really good at it. How? By practicing it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Practice it everywhere you go. And you'll mess up sometimes. You'll be aggressive accidentally sometimes, and all of that.
We're human.
Because we're humans, But this is such a critical thing. Is that? And Aristotle talks about this. We are whatever we repeatedly do. Okay. So if we repeatedly react to this person, then we become that. Now, our true self is still there. It's not that it's gone, but it's overshadowed by all these other factors that Mark was talking about. And so you're sort of stuck in this milieu. For lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And so not playing the game. And then the other thing I want to address is the question is, how do we get into this? I'm a former biologist, so I'm big on this. The brain biology, is in trauma bonding. So if you're in an emotionally abusive relationship, you are being traumatized. Everything that we've already talked about. You are being traumatized.
Yep.
And usually the way it goes, at least with narcissists anyway, is they'll traumatize you, and then they'll switch completely, and be loving, sexual, whatever the case might be. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is you get addicted to the yin and the yang of that. So in other words, the adrenaline that goes off when they attack you. Okay, that's adrenaline, followed by dopamine and other, comforting type naturally occurring drugs in our body. So then what happens is what becomes normal, which is what you were talking about earlier. This is normal to me. This is just the way things are. You accept it because it's normal. Mm-hmm. But you are addicted to, through trauma bonding, to the combination of adrenaline followed by dopamine. Mm-hmm. And so there's a biological thing going on in your body and your brain through this whole thing. And so it's real.
Oh, yes.
So those neural pathways are then being created, and those are the easiest, smoothest paths to travel. So it's reflexive, is what I hear you saying.
Yes. Becomes reflexive, yeah.
Is that why people are too afraid to leave the relationship? Dysfunctional relationships that I work with as a pastor, the familiarity is predictable, and the predictability is safe, even though the relationship is anything but safe. Is that what causes people to stay in relationships? In fact, I don't want to generalize, but in 2020, amid COVID, where everyone was isolated, following that, I can name 5 or 6 relationships, friends, marriages that are now have ended in divorce. A lot came out in that time. I'm just curious, what's going on here, guys?
Something that we're taught early on in counseling. Have you ever heard the term secondary gain?
Very much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
talk to the listeners about that.
Yeah, so, and this is something I want to validate too, especially if you're in a relationship and you feel stuck, I want to validate that there probably is a secondary gain. We look for this, and it could be financial, it could be cultural, it could be religious, saving face, as they say. I do believe that you who are listening, if you're in one of these relationships, you probably do have some good reasoning to stay in there, and I want to validate that. And that's where, I want to also drive the point home of, this doesn't have to be, and there are some ways out, and there are ways to heal from this. And, I do have a lot of hope, especially for those that are experiencing the abuse, because, again, you could say you're probably the one that's probably the most empathic and can feel compassion more easily, and that's a good thing. I think a lot of people will say, oh, I just give in, and that's a good intention that you have. Even that part that's empathic, has a good intention for you. It's trying to keep you alive. It's trying to keep you, and if you have children, keep them safe, keep them fed, keep them in school. It's trying to keep the status quo by dealing with all this stuff, you could say, that you're putting up with. So it's, I just want to validate that person who's deep in it right now. And, it's not as easy as, and you've probably heard it from family and friends, why don't you just leave? What's wrong with you? You're better than this. And, I get where they're coming from, but I can also understand it's not that easy. And as a therapist, it's extremely frustrating, because we're mandated reporters. If you've heard that, we have to report if we notice any sexual, physical, certain levels of emotional, illegal, emotional abuse or neglect in children, dependent adults, and elders, so 65 and up. But if somebody's in the midst of being domestically abused, we're not allowed to report that unless I'm seeing the person who's abusing, they're saying, I'm going to go home and, shoot my spouse. I can't do anything because they could just smile at me and tell their fancy story. And that's extremely frustrating. So I know even our system is not in favor of protecting those who are in these states. And that's where, if you can even break out, listening to this podcast, just opening your mind up, getting a 10,000-foot view of what's actually happening. Or, I want to give a great book suggestion.
Please.
In regard to setting those boundaries. It's called When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. And it's by Manuel J. Smith. You can get it on Amazon. And
yeah, I'll link to that in the show notes,
please
guys.
do.
So, yeah.
And it's all therapists, whenever they have clients that are experiencing boundary issues, are just like, read this book.
Yep.
And, it helps you. It talks you through situations, helps you practice. I don't want to say makes perfect, but it gets better. But it allows you to practice and see situations, as simple as, when I go to the store and, I'm making a return and I feel bad for making the return. It allows you to say, I'm returning this and I'd like my money back. It was defective, or I didn't need it and I'm within the return policy window. It just helps you deal with even simple situations up to those much more intense relational ones. So, and I would also suggest, if there's any way, even if you see somebody or know of somebody that you deem as healthy in your inner or outer circle, if you can get to them and just let them know what you're experiencing and just kind of bounce it off of them, be like, hey, what do you think about this? My husband or my wife or my boyfriend, girlfriend, mom, dad, they're saying this about me. Is that true? Because sometimes we do need that, and that's where the connection comes in. And that's where we need to reconnect, come out of isolation if we can.
I want to draw a line in the sand for listeners today, because we've taken a deep dive in many ways today. How do we distinguish truly between, this is a challenging time in the relationship versus this is repeated emotional abuse and I need to get out. We've touched on it, but let's hit the target.
Well, and that is the distinction there. It's a pattern of a continuous pattern of continuous pattern of behavior, because everyone, if well, I'm not going to say everyone, maybe Mother Teresa didn't, but, for the most part, everyone has probably crossed the line of saying something that we might characterize as abusive, whether it's gaslighting or whether it's, playing games with a person or being passive aggressive or whatever the case. So that's a given, I think, that, so the question is, are you normal? Normal
right.
has to do with healthy. Okay. I like to just use the words interchangeably. And so if you have a continuous pattern in your relationship with this person that is abusive, then you're constantly on the receiving end of it. Or even if it's episodic, but it's episodic often enough. In other words, there's a long-term pattern going on here because it will cycle. It will cycle. It does increase during periods of stress, which you just said. During no question,
Yes.
during COVID.
Sure.
If you think about, just take the average family with 2 or 3 kids, and they're in their 40s or something, okay? And COVID hits, and all of a sudden they're forced to homeschool, which not only do they not know how to do, they've never done before, and they don't have time because they both have jobs, okay? And maybe they just, maybe a loved one just passed away on top of that. We've seen a lot of that, of course, this year, not just from COVID, but even from other illnesses. And so if you take into account, maybe somebody gets hit, say a family gets hit with 3, 4, 5 different, I don't know, however many different things at once, the stress levels go way up. And then the opportunity to be abusive goes up. And then, but it's episodic. In other words, it happened because of something. Okay. And now that something is over and we go back to so-called normal. Okay. So that is, families always for all of history, go through periods of high stress.
Sure.
And individuals go through periods of high stress. And so it's not really that unusual that someone might act out of character during that period of time or something like that. So, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Exactly.
I mean, we are in a sense because we just went through this long COVID thing, which was extended. This is very unusual. I mean, it's happened before, but not recently. And so, so that's I think something to consider. Is it's really, we're talking about a constant pattern, probably lifelong pattern of abuse that is unrelenting. It's not going to change. And I do want to mention a couple things. You asked, why do people stay in the relationship?
Yes.
And part of it is, I said addiction and and all that stuff. But there's a couple more. And one is, think about it. The person who's being abused is typically empathic. Okay, so they know it's their spouse or their significant other or whatever, whoever they're dealing with that's abusing them, they know their background and they feel sorry for them. Why? Because they have empathy and they understand why the person's acting the way they are because they know their background. And one woman I talked to, she finally did end up having to leave her husband, but she said, and this was like 2 years before, and she said, but I feel so sorry for him because I know what he grew up with. I know his background. I know how he was abused as a child. And she said, and that's what's killing me, the guilty thing that you were just talking about. So I think that's a really important thing. There's one more thing, and that's blackmail. That keeps people in relationships. Just a week ago, a man committed suicide. I read about it in the newspaper. He was married, so he's in a relationship, committed relationship, and it went back. It was a very abusive relationship, and he just finally felt so trapped, but he was being blackmailed. I'm going to expose you for who you are to other people. I'm going to tell other people what you're really like. So they get you to blow up, they get you upset, they get you angry, and then they say, I'm going to tell people about what you just did.
Yep.
And then that's blackmail. And that keeps people in relationships also.
Sometimes they'll even document it.
Right. And by the way, if you are in a relationship, our listeners, if you're in a relationship where this is constantly happening, document, do it quietly.
Yeah.
Yes.
But write down the date, the time, the place, what was said, if you can record it. Because if you do need to get out of a relationship safely
and need legal help,
you better document it. And this is really hard because people don't want to do that. And it's hard work for one thing, but beyond that, it's just, well, I don't really want to do that. I feel guilty about doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is my husband or my wife or my whatever, and I feel guilty about doing that. Get over it if this is a pattern. But you see, I could be talking to a narcissist right now and says, that's a really great way. I think I'll document it too. And and I've seen it. I've seen it where the narcissist documented false things, very false things, and then used it in court against their significant other.
Oh my word!
It's the word. Two words come to mind: insidious and hideous.
Mm-hmm.
And evil. There's evil there.
Yeah,
too.
there's evil there, and evil intent.
Yeah, malintent.
And it's real.
Yeah.
So in fact, I'll for our Downton Abbey watchers.
Yeah.
If you remember Mr. Bates is a military man, big, strong military man. He's married to a woman. He goes to war, comes back. She's been unfaithful to him and all this stuff. And then she goes out and steals something and blames him for it. And he goes to jail for it. Okay, I mean, just as an example. And in fact, there's 2 cases of that in Downton Abbey, where a woman went to jail because her husband, or her boyfriend, her significant other, talked her into doing something she shouldn't have done. Yeah. So that's another thing is destroying your values. I'm going to say this with narcissists anyway. Part of it is to corrupt you. Mm-hmm. It is to corrupt you. To play their game and to get you to go against your own values. Mm-hmm. And that's a really serious one. But and I would say that's level 3 narcissism, 3 to 4 narcissism, not so much level 2.
Yeah.
But it really is insidious.
I want to interject real fast and say, folks, I'm going to put a link in the show notes at wintoday.tv/episode 267 to my first conversation with Dave Strubler regarding narcissism. So you can go there, listen to that conversation. So that'll sort of inform a lot of the context for today's as well. But Mark, anything you want to add before I kind of turn the page?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's interesting in regard to the levels about when it crosses from, kind of this, and I would call it Michael Scott, from The Office, the level 2 narcissist. For anybody who's a fan of The Office like myself, you watch it and you're like, oh my gosh, this guy, he's awful. And then if you really watch through, you say, oh, this kid didn't grow up with a father. He had a stepfather he despised. He was bullied. He was isolated, and now all he wants is friends. And you see the levels he goes just to make friends. And I think he said, if I want to get married so I can have 100 kids, so that I can have 100 friends that will never leave me. And we laugh about that, but at the same time, and he portrayed the character well. I hear a lot of pain there. And I have a lot of hope for that person who's at that level. And even the level 3, you could say, and that's where I would really want to encourage you. If you feel like, hey, maybe I'm doing this to somebody, I don't want to, just label you in this awful way. I want to encourage you to, come and talk with somebody, whether it be a therapist or a trusted friend, somebody on the outside who you deem as trustworthy. Mm-hmm. and just bounce this off of them. Again, take that 10,000 foot view, and just the fact that you have the question of what's going on inside of me that I'm treating other people this way. I have a lot of hope for that person who's maybe, again, experienced a lot of pain and is trying to make sense of it through bringing others into their pain, just to feel at home. So, I would add that. But again, going back to the levels, there's that point where you move from that kind of person to the malintent. And that's where, damage is done either way on both parties, mainly toward the one that's being abused. But, I just want to call it out for what it is. And I hope that's what we're doing here, is just saying, this is what it is. This is what it looks like. And Dad, maybe you can name off some of the behaviors that they would experience.
I would love that. Yeah. That'd be really helpful.
And these are just samples. There's so many.
Certainly.
And I would encourage anyone who's in this situation to do some research. And there's some great articles out there, very readable. I don't mean research articles.
You may have written a couple of them.
I have written a few.
Yeah, we'll put a link because you write for psychology.
But beyond
today.
that, but even beyond anything I've written,
sure,
there are many good resources of the kinds of behaviors. And so invalidation is definitely one of them. And so undermining you, dismissing you or your thoughts, or even distorting what you said, like twisting it, things like that. Accusing you of being too sensitive, that's not an unusual one. Oh, here's a really good one. Accusing you of being selfish and needy or materialistic or whatever. Another one that I see is chaos. Literally creating chaos, like creating storms on purpose.
Oh, yes.
And flying into sometimes even a rage to stir things up and getting you to, of course, then your adrenaline's up and all of that, and to create confusion. One I saw that was very interesting was at work, where a guy actually made one statement very affirmatively. He just looked at all of us and said, "This is the way it is." And I'm not kidding you. In less than 5 minutes, he said the exact opposite, just as emphatically. And all of us in the room looked at each other like, what just happened? How could someone say this and be so clear about it and so confident about it, and then literally state the exact opposite a few minutes later?
That's where that blended part stuff comes in.
That's where it comes from.
Yeah, whoever that person is, there was that intention. They had some kind of intention there, and they knew that by saying something this way, and then 5 minutes later saying the opposite just as emphatically, they knew it would create something and would bring everybody into the chaos, into the pain, and everybody, and this is what I just want to briefly say, then we can go back to the list, is, the person who's experiencing the abuse, these are some of what's happening inside. What's probably happening for that person is anxiety, depression, angry outbursts, self-harm, suicidal thoughts. These are things that you could be experiencing if you're being, emotionally abused, and it's usually self-directed. What's wrong with me? You're oversleeping, or you're not sleeping enough, or you're anxious, or you have these angry outbursts like, why am I so angry? What's wrong with me? Or if you're in those places of, I don't know if I can get out, then it's, the suicidal thoughts come up. And also in that regard, self-harm, maybe it's cutting or something like that, where they've lost so much of their feeling. I'm not saying just physical feeling, that they will cut in order just to feel something. It's not usually with the intention to take yourself out. It's just, I just want to feel something, and that's why I do this. Wow. And this is how it shows up with people. These are kind of the symptoms you could be experiencing. And again, I just want to say it's not your fault.
But that's really empowering. Do you have anything else on the list that we should?
Well, there's some.
go over?
One of the phrases you'll hear a lot. In fact, there's a book called. I think it's called "Don't Walk on Eggshells" or something like that. Forgive me, I don't. But that's in the title.
I'll find it. Yeah, I'll find it.
But the emotional outbursts or the chaos causes you on the receiving end to always walk on eggshells. Is it, when's the person going to go off the rails? And I don't want to set them off the rails. Well, that's part of the control thing, because they want you to think that. They want you to think that if you say the wrong thing, that I'll react to.
There's the power and control.
Yeah, power and control.
Again.
It's right back to by design, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
Yep.
So walking on eggshells is a pretty common kind of situation that the abused finds themselves in. They are literally, and I've heard people just come right out and say that. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells all the time, and that's by design. And another one is acting inferior. I mean, at making you feel inferior. And so in other words, you're inferior to me. I'm superior to you. You're not in my league. Okay, that kind of thing. Or I have all this power and all this, I don't know. Often, I hate to say it, but a lot of leaders are narcissists, and narcissists are leaders. It's common in our society, and because they love power, and they're often charismatic. They're usually smart. They are manipulative, and they play people against each other and all that sort of thing. But they're good at it. What can I say? And so I think that's another kind of thing we see. Even but acting superior to others, and making you feel that, and like, so for making a joke at your expense in front of others. I've seen that at work quite a bit. I've seen that as a very, very common thing, I would say, at work. So those are some of the things. I mean, there's a long list that we could talk about. Sure. But and I would encourage our listeners to really look at those, because you may be experiencing any number of these. Now, if it's periodic, if it's every once in a while or something like that, you're probably not in an abusive relationship. It's just the person, maybe they're having a bad day or something, But if this is consistently practiced by this person, then you're in an abusive relationship, and then the big choices come. Yes. Do I stay in the relationship? If I do stay in the relationship, how do I set boundaries? How do I manage it so that I can stay in the relationship somewhat successfully, knowing it's not going to be perfect, and that's true, but so that I can, because there might be, for example, children involved. That, in other words, is it bad enough that I would leave and know that would disrupt my family? It's a huge choice. Huge choice. Yeah. And I can't tell anybody what to do or not to do, but there's a lot of things they need to consider. But probably the first thing, going back to what Mark said, is that them learning to manage it as well as they can, to learn to be assertive. Now, I will say it's hard to be assertive if you don't have someone else to check reality with. In other words, if you're in a relationship with somebody who's abusive and they're trying to take away your reality, then you need a counselor or friend or someone, a confidant, that can give you feedback so that you're really not nuts, okay, but that you really are in a difficult relationship. And the very act of being connected to healthy others, so critical.
Yes.
But that kind of goes without saying, in a sense, or it should go without saying, that your whole life really centers around the quality of your life, centers around the quality of your relationships and the people that you're with. If you're surrounded by lots of toxic people, And there are significant relationships and there's significant dysfunction. You have to think about whether or not you can afford to stay in that world.
Yeah.
And that's a tough decision. There's
Yeah.
nothing. So I don't want to minimize how difficult that is.
Yeah. You can't be vulnerable with everybody because a lot of people will not honor your true self. And maybe they don't know how to do that themselves, or they'll give you, the typical friend advice. Oh, don't worry about it. Just get over it. But it is important to, if you can, and again, like you said, going outside of your current relationships, to find somebody that is either objective, like a therapist of some sorts, or, maybe it's like, hey, when I was younger, I had this really good friend. I haven't been in touch, and they were always a really healthy person. I felt, at ease around them. I felt like I could be myself, much different than I feel today. Maybe I'll reach out to them, and make that connection again. But then just, once you kind of deem that that's a healthy, safe relationship, confiding, and that's when you can bounce that off a little bit.
I think about the fact that a lot of us have, all of us have strengths. As Dave, you talked about leadership, charisma, strong ability to direct. But I think about the fact that any strength overextended under stress becomes a liability to us. And I'd like to propose that for many, when we're not dealing with the issues of the heart and we allow them to fester and stay in a place of unhealth, it distorts our ability to lead well, to lead our families well, to be in a healthy marriage. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just thinking, from the perspective of a parent of young kids. And I want to speak to all the parents out there almost as a preventative measure, so that I don't want to say create kids that, get into these situations, because that's never the intention of any parent. You're not trying to create a kid to get into these situations. But again, it starts with us reflecting on what's going on in our own homes, as parents, and saying, how am I interacting with my sons and or daughters? And, none of us are perfect, even the healthier ones. And am I being a little emotionally abusive at times? Oh, I am. Maybe I need to get some good feedback on that. And then as you do your work, showing your children how to set boundaries and really connect to their hearts, their own sense of self, helping them develop that sense of self, I think is very important in this. And that will help them, because they're going to come across all types of people. You can only do so much to protect them, when they're 18, 19, 20, and they're off maybe at college or in their jobs. They're going to come across somebody who's going to exude some of these behaviors. And if they can have that sense of boundary, like, oh, they're crossing a boundary right now. They said this kind of abusive thing to me. They commented on the way I look, and it made me feel bad. Instead of them, getting into that cycle, if they can recognize that right away, they can say, I'm not going to spend time with that person, and then that they can make that boundary and then, move away from it. Or if they have, in a work situation, maybe they have a boss who acts in an abusive manner, and you didn't know that when you got hired onto the job, then you can understand, how do I deal with that person? But in a healthy way that, affirms, what is true about you, what is true about the situation.
What do you say to the person listening today who said, I've tried to deal with emotional abuse in a relationship, but when I did, it seemed to backfire. It seemed to make matters worse.
Well, it can. And sometimes I'm going to say that's necessary. We would, empathic people especially, want to avoid the storms of life. They want to avoid not only dysfunction, but they want contention. They don't like it. It's not, they don't consider it to be healthy or good. Makes them feel very uncomfortable. They don't know what to do with it. And so, but here's the challenge. Sometimes you have to go through a storm, but you have to go through it. That means you enter it, you're in it, and you come out the other side. That takes a lot of faith and a lot of trust to do that. Because when you go into the storm, naturally the clouds are dark, they're menacing, it's horrible. Everything that you can see is not looking good. And so trusting that you can walk through this storm, go through the worst of it, and come out the other side is really the key. That's called resilience. So how does that happen? Well, going back to what Mark said, teaching your children resilience really is about teaching them how to set assertive boundaries so that when somebody bullies them in school or on the bus or something like that, they know how to go through that storm. They're not going to go around the storm because they still got to get back on the bus. And the kid that's bullying them may not have changed, may not have a light bulb go on yet. And maybe not, it doesn't even realize it's abusive, And so it's really important for us to develop resilience and to teach our children resilience, teach ourselves and develop it and practice it. It does require sometimes going through the storm as opposed to avoiding it or going around it. What most people do if they're empaths and they're being abused, they're walking on eggshells and they're trying to avoid the storms. If you do what Mark suggested, which is, the assertive approach, assertive boundary approach, that can set off a firestorm. It can.
Yeah.
It can.
But the good news is this. You're guilty of nothing. And you have to be assured of that. In other words, I was assertive. I set a boundary. I was appropriately demonstrating a proper kind of self-care. In other words, it wasn't selfish. It wasn't selfish care. It was self-care. That's what that is. And if I know, if I'm grounded in that, I understand that, and I practice it and get good at it, now it could end the relationship. Because the last thing that, especially narcissists want, is they're getting called out. And also, you're not playing their game anymore. And it's no fun.
Yeah.
It's just because I can't control you.
Yeah.
Taking the wind out of their sail.
Yeah. Exactly. And if you end up having to leave a relationship, if that ends up being the case, the easiest thing to do is to get hoovered back into it. Because the emotions are there, all the memories are there, all the wiring is there, all of that's there. And it's easy to get pulled back in and to be able to say, no, I'm just literally not going there.
I want to remind everyone that no is a complete sentence and you can use it. No is a beautifully complete sentence.
Yes.
It's very empowering. All right, so landing this plane, how do we heal if we've been victimized in a relationship that is emotionally abusive?
Well, I'm going to let Mark mostly talk about this because that's his expertise.
Great.
I just want to make one comment.
Please.
It goes back to interdependence.
Yeah.
And that is that interdependence is mature and it's healthy. Independence is pretty much nothing more than extended adolescence. It has a place in our life for a short time. Now, the reason I bring this up is even when it's with addiction, let's just say, the opposite, of addiction is not sobriety, it's connectedness. And I didn't come up with that one. Somebody else did, but famous psychologist. Yeah. So the point is that in terms of recovering, I don't think there's any question. It's about becoming connected. Where that gets difficult is if I've been isolated for a long time and I've had a smear campaign done against me. I've been cut off from my family. I've been cut off from my friends. I'm, sort of in this hole with this person and they're controlling me. Then you're afraid to enter relationships. That's part of the game here. You're you're afraid to enter even healthy relationships because you've been so harmed by a relationship. The closest relationship to you is what one man said. He said, 20 years of marriage. 20 years of marriage, the closest relationship to me. And she dismissed me like I was nothing. And it was over. And there was nothing I could do about it. And so that's my only 2 cents on that, is that interconnectedness, interdependence, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of terms for it, I believe is essential to healing.
You have a book coming out around the subject, right?
Well, it's interdependence is a major theme in the book.
Okay.
The book is called Tiny House Redemption.
Yeah. And
it is actually about largely how individuals, groups, and organizations can act in an interdependent manner, working together, collaborating, co-creating is what we call it, to produce what I call redemptive transformation. So that's the idea, is that everyone's purpose in life, whether they know it or not, okay, I'm making a bold assertion here, is redemptive transformation. So if that's my purpose and I know that, then the question is, well, for Dave or Chris or for Mark, what does that look like in the real world? In other words, when I go forward in my life, what you do for redemptive transformation is not going to be the same thing that I do, right? Because we're all unique, as I said earlier. But if that's our purpose, then we can collaborate, then we can. But if redemptive transformation is not our purpose, which is often the case with the abuser, right? Getting back to our abuse, then you're probably never going to achieve mature, healthy interdependence with that person. And I think Mark's going to talk a little bit about that, the fact that there's some things you can't fix.
Yeah, take us there, Mark.
Yeah. And when I think about healing, we easily will go to a doctor. Oh, I got a gash in my arm. I broke my leg. I have this, condition. You go there and you get medication for it. They treat it, whatever. And with mental wounds, as you talk about, like the black and blue brain, is that how you?
Yeah, the black and blue bruises of the heart.
Yes, exactly. And when I think about emotional abuse, I think about death by 1,000 cuts. And I'm not going to focus on the death part here. But that's what the person who's abusing is thinking. I'm going to get this person. I'm just going to nick at them over and over, and I'm going to break them down slowly. But it's when we can, again, step outside of that just for moments. And again, this isn't just you do steps 1, 2, and 3. Your situation is unique. This is where, again, getting some feedback outside of your normal realm, again, I know I keep saying therapists. I'm a big proponent of it. What can I say?
I think everybody needs a counselor.
Yes. At least for
a season.
Yes. Whether it's 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. Whatever.
We all have blind spots.
We all do.
And I'm okay being vulnerable. You and I talked often.
Yes.
In 2020, I called you. We talked, and when I texted you, and Mark, I'm struggling with XYZ. And I just want to say, folks, listen. I'm as much a learner in this process. We are all in process. We all have blind spots.
Yes.
So anyway.
I see my own therapist every other week just so I can keep my head on straight.
As do I.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a weird thing to go talk with somebody and have some real talk.
That's good.
So again, back to the idea of healing here, going and seeing a therapist or somebody who's just really loving, in your community or an old friend, again, somebody who you can be vulnerable with, and you can open up and show them those wounds. Say, I've been cut 1,000 times by this person or these people, and I'm in pain. I don't know what to do. Here's what's happening. That's the first step. Again, bringing awareness to what has been happening. The next, asking for help. And then from there, it's doing the work of going through either themes of what's happened, or if there's what we call big T traumas, kind of the big ones, or I'd even call the death by a thousand cuts all little T traumas, or it's like the comments we talked about earlier, or, what's wrong with you? Just all those little statements, they add up over time. And again, another important aspect here is the relationship with that person or those people. So in order to heal, you need to reconnect to yourself and reconnect to others. That's the most important thing. Because I'm not going to say it right. There's a awesome therapist over in Grand Rapids, and he uses this quote from his trainer, Brian Nixon. And I'm going to mess it up, but the idea is, we can be hurt in relationships, but we also heal through relationship. It's much more succinct. I'll find it if I can. But again, we're healed in relationship. So if you're with a healthy person who can sit there, with your wounds wide open, bleeding and it's throbbing, who can just look at that with love and kindness and compassion in their heart, that's a huge step. Say, I can sit with your stuff and it's okay. And you're not crazy. And I understand why you've stayed. And
that's powerful.
What do you want to do here? What factors are here? Are there kids? Are there financials? Are there, religious feelings of obligation you have for you to stay? Okay, I get that. Somebody who can sit with all that, not try to fix you, but can just accept you as you are. That's the path. And then, I could say like, oh, use this intervention, that intervention, but I think it's specific to the person, and that's where the relationship again comes in. Because the research clearly shows that it's not the intervention that's used. It's not cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR or dialectical behavior therapy or narrative therapy. Those are all great and powerful, but it's the relationship. Because if somebody comes in and sees me and they're like, no, I don't trust this guy, how are we going to get anything done? I could do the fanciest stuff in the world. Doesn't matter. It's all about, does that person feel comfortable? So again, it's getting with somebody that you feel comfortable with, that you can be yourself, that you can speak the truth, and they're not going to say, oh, is that really true? They're not going to do the same thing.
That's really helpful. Go ahead, Dave.
And going forward too. So let's say you do exactly that, and it's about connectedness. Then it's about being selective, of course, but going into more relationships over time, where you enter into healthy relationships. So, for example, you may have a mentor. Dr. Lauren Siffring has been my mentor for 42 years. I've met with him every Monday for 42 years, just about. And just was there this morning, in fact. And but the point is that when you build into your life solid relationships, even when you have one that's not, you can deal with that better because you're grounded in these other relationships. So every month, it's Mondays with Lauren. Okay. Tuesdays, I go to a monastery and I go to a quiet place. I sit in my tiny house out there and I'm with people that are caring and loving, and it's peaceful. And I receive from that situation. Wednesday morning, I have a men's meeting. Saturday morning, I go to a men's meeting. And I want to say this. I need this. I do. It's yes, I do contribute in each of those. And I receive. And it's not transactional, it's transformational. Very different. So, but here, let me just say this. If the abuser does their abuse by design, then you on the other end need to live your life by design too. You need to have that therapist. You need to have that mentor. You need to have that friend or maybe family member who understands you and you can open yourself up to. And I would say, if you're an introvert, okay, we'll say 3 to 5 people, okay? Now, I'm an extrovert, so that's about 1,000 people. But I'm overstating it, of course. Sure. But you get the point.
I do.
The point is being deliberately connected to healthy people is really the key. And it's so hard when someone's been in isolation and they're coming out of it and they're fearful and can I trust anyone and all that. And I get it. But I'm telling you, that is worth the risk.
Yeah.
Because there are healthy people in this world with whom you can connect. And you need to be deliberate about that. And that is your healing. And then if that becomes the largest part of your life, then this abuser over here starts to diminish in their influence. And they don't have the control anymore. And the one thing narcissists hate is losing that control.
Yes.
They really don't like that.
Yeah.
So
that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Are you taking new telehealth clients?
Yes, and in person.
Tell people how to connect with you.
Sure. So my website is markstrublercounseling.com.
We'll link to it in the show notes, of course, too. So,
yeah.
And then, you guys know how to connect with me on social. I'll throw this in Instagram as well. I want to land in a little obscure place because there are multitudes of people listening, and I can't forsake the fact that maybe someone's listening today and they are saying, someone's actually told me I'm emotionally abusive and my balloons are getting popped right now. How do I change? How do I heal?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I've been asked many times, is it, especially when I was talking about the narcissist and especially level 3 and above. And this is a tough one because, here's the question. Is there hope for the narcissist? Is there hope for the abuser? The answer is yes, there is. And at the same time, for them to do that, and this is the hardest thing for the abuser, is to become self-aware. It's just the hardest thing. And whether they're just a level 2 narcissist, let's say, and they're just, in some cases, they may literally think that because again, their logic, which is pathological, is normal to them. So it's right that I talk to you this way. It's normal that I talk to you this way. And they may be really, truly, completely unaware of what they're doing. That is possible. And I have greater hope for that person who then gets confronted. Go back to Downton Abbey. Mary, one of the main characters, the sister, the older sister. She's a bully to her younger sister. And finally, one of the main characters who cares for her deeply calls her out and says, "You're a bully." Just comes right out and says it. "You're a bully." And all of a sudden, Mary goes, "Oh, gee, I don't think of myself as a bully." But Mary was a bully. So sometimes sometimes, and by the way, the role that all of us play in society is sometimes we have to be that person that calls someone out.
Yes.
I did it 3 days ago.
Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. You're a bully, or you're this, or you're whatever the case might be. And the person that I think is at that level, there's hope for them for sure. Really tough when you start getting up into levels 4 and 5 because it is so deeply seated, so ingrained, so part of the brain neurology, all that stuff. Yes. I'm not saying it's impossible. Anything is possible with God. That's what I always say.
Right.
So it's not that. It's just that is a really challenging thing to come out of. And of course, if there's no self-awareness at all, and the typical high-level narcissist, that's why they're a narcissist. They're not self-aware. They're selfish, but they're not self-aware. And I don't know, what do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think folks at that level, the higher levels, the person that they have been abusing has become their drug almost.
Yes.
And a break has to happen, and it has to stay that way. It's like if somebody's, a regular, drug user, to the point where, they're going off on binges for days and they're losing all their money and their family's neglected and they're, waking up in the hospital, just very extreme things. They need to address that relationship to whatever drug or drugs that's going on. And I do believe, for somebody who's at that level, they have to abstain completely. And that's where, if the person who's abusing at those higher levels, if they can just have that moment of clarity and get some help for like, hey, I think I got to stop. Something's wrong. Something goes too far. While that person who has been abused needs to go and heal, that person who has been abusing needs to basically treat that person, say, I treated that person as a drug. I got used to the cycle, and that became normal to me. And I have to abstain from being around that person for their sake, because I've hurt them so much, and for my own sake, so that I can learn how to be in relationship with others in a healthy way and address my own pain in my life. So it's harder, of course, but there has to be some hope there.
My prayer for all of you today, for all of us today, because those of us in the room today are not exempt from this, is that we would utilize a level of self-awareness that would lead us to self-knowledge, that would lead us to repentance, the metanoia, the about face that is a change of nature, that changes behavior, that changes the course of our lives. And that's why I'm so grateful for you too today. Anything else? This has just been wildly rich, and I'm so thankful, but I don't want to leave the conversation without making sure that you've shared the entirety of what you want to say.
The only other thing I want to add on what Mark just said was that one author calls this the narcissist supply, the addiction. And that's how it's referred to, is that the narcissist, you are the narcissist supply. And so it's important for the narcissist, if they really want to change, is to recognize what Mark just said, that you are the source of addiction, you are the supply. Wow. And so any addictive anything, you have to remove yourself from. I mean, that's just that pretty much. The other thing is, I recently heard, forgive me, I forget the gentleman's name. He's a professor at, I believe, UCLA, but he talks about the 3 levels of forgiveness. And where this comes into play, in a normal, healthy relationship, you have exoneration. I say something wrong to you, I'm abusive to you, and you call me out on it, and I say, would you please forgive me? And then you forgive me. That's exoneration. Forbearance occurs when, and this is pretty normal, if you're a parent and you got kids, okay, and they're young and they're inexperienced and they're being inappropriate or whatever, there's some degree of forbearance we have to deal with. So in other words, we don't call them out, we don't force them to, but we still may hold them accountable. But so forbearance is something we have to exercise as a matter of, it's a type of forgiveness. Okay. And because we know that eventually that person's going to outgrow that and all that. When you're dealing, though, with an abuser, there's no evidence at all that this person's going to stop. In fact, it's probably ramping up and growing. The last level of forgiveness is called release.
Yes.
And this means that I'm literally letting go of this. First of all, I'm going to let go of the relationship, and if it's that kind of a situation, I'm going to let go of it physically, and in addition to that, then I have to let go of it in here, because that's what entraps the abused person. It does, because they tend to go back. I mean, it's so common for people to go back. You've heard this, people to go back to their abuser. It's so common, but that's why.
Yeah.
And because it's a two-way addiction, really.
It is. There's a built intensity there where it's like you're feeding off each other's intensity. And it is. It's hard to break. And it's not just, like I said earlier, a little 1, 2, 3 step. And I mean, I would just add, grateful to you, Chris, for bringing this conversation
thank you.
out
so
there. And I'm happy to be here to talk about this. And I know you are.
I am.
And if anybody just needs help and direction on where do I go, I'm happy to always point somebody in a direction as best I can.
Well, that was a lengthy but hopefully value-adding conversation to you. Emotional abuse is a big deal, and we need to talk about it more. So if you want to connect with Mark for personal counseling, go to markstrublercounseling.com, wintoday.tv/episode 267. I'll have a link in the show notes. You can get a hold of Mark. You can read Dave's articles on Psychology Today or buy a copy of any of the books we mentioned in today's conversation. So go there right now, wintoday.tv/episode 267. And listen, 2 days from now, we're continuing a similar conversation. We're talking about clinical depression, the downward spiral, and holding on when you want to let go. Sheila Walsh is my guest, and here is a preview of that conversation.
My immediate response was, well, no, thank you. I don't want any of your happy pills. And he said, no, those are street drugs. We don't do those here. And he helped me understand all about brain chemistry, that some of us simply don't produce enough, serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine, and that the drugs are simply bringing our levels back to a healthy place where we can deal with, because it wasn't like the pills were going to take away the issues.
Right.
The pills were going to make it possible for me to deal with the issues that were going to come up. So that combination was vital for me.
That conversation is coming up in 2 days right here on Win Today. Don't miss it. Thanks again for joining the conversation this week right here on Win Today. I believe people just like you should be able to live successful, meaningful lives, and that's why I want to invite you to join the inner circle of readers on my email list who get weekly, well-researched self-improvement tips. So right now, go to wintoday.tv to sign up. It's absolutely free. And lastly, whether you're a new listener or have been listening to the show for a while, I'd really appreciate your rating and review of Win Today on the Apple Podcast app. So right now, will you write a short, honest review? Doing so helps expand the listenership of Win Today, and that would mean a ton to me. Thanks again for listening today. I hope you have an awesome week. We'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.